Everyone. My name is Ted Harris, and I'm with the Pennsylvania Petroleum Association. I wanted to thank you for getting on this morning. This morning's webinar will be 5 keys to a successful tank monitoring strategy, presented by Tank Utility. We are going on about a year anniversary for offering this monthly webinar series through the association. It happens the first Tuesday at 9 a.m. each month. So I thank you all for being a part of this one. If this is your first time, welcome. If it's you've been on one before, thanks for coming back. At this point, before I introduce our presenters, I would just like to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the webinar. There is a question feature where you can type in a question. You're going to be muted the entire time, but I think that the group from Tank Utility, they're going to try to stop throughout the presentation if they do get a question to kind of answer at that point. And then if there's something at the end of the presentation where you want to just ask once it's over, there will be a Q&A also at the end. So again, this is, in the past, these presentations, in my opinion, have been much better when it's just interactive and there's questions from the audience. So we encourage you to do that. With that being said, I'm going to introduce Chris and Collin from Tank Utility and pass it over to them. Thank you, guys.
And sorry about that. We actually just had a little technical glitch with our webinar, with our presentation. So pulling that up real quick. Great. I'm really excited to be here today, and we are Tank Utility, and I have with me, my name's Chris Brablc. I lead marketing here at Tank Utility, so I help fuel suppliers ultimately, market and sell tank monitoring to their customers. Collin works on the kind of inner workings of making sure that tank monitoring is successfully bought, deployed, and that fuel suppliers are actually seeing savings from tank monitoring services. And so, as Ted said, what we really want to do today is be able to provide some, kind of a good overview of tank monitoring, but we also want it to be interactive. So feel free to ask questions throughout. We will definitely be monitoring the question section, and we'll answer those questions as soon as we see them. So please feel free to let us know and ask anything that might be kind of itching your brain in terms of what you want to know about tank monitoring. But as we kind of go through it, this is a general overview. So we're always available if you want to reach out to us after the session. So Collin, how are you doing today? How are you feeling about tank monitoring and today's webinar?
Feeling pretty good. Thanks everybody for jumping on here. Definitely want to reiterate the idea of jumping in here, making this more of a conversation. Any questions that come through, let them fire and we'll try to handle it and open up to a conversation.
Great. So as we talked about today, we're really going to be looking at what makes successful tank monitoring. When we think about tank monitoring, if it's done right, it's strategic. And it's going to be something that really helps your business to earn more profit, increase profitability, earn higher margins throughout that process. It's not just this, product that you buy and it depreciates over time and it provides a little bit of value, but we think that it can be extremely important to your business and help you differentiate your business from the competition. And so today, what we're going to look at is 5, key points that we work with our customers on around tank monitoring. First, that buying process. So all the kind of things that you should think about as you're evaluating providers, as you're asking them questions. Then we're going to look at, once you buy, how do you deploy? What are the methods for picking which tanks to put your monitors on? What are the kind of best practices when you're actually going out and physically deploying those devices? We'll also look at scaling and how do you maintain your fleet of monitors once you have hundreds of them out in the field, but also when do you think about putting more out, right? And how do you kind of adjust to that process? Then we're going to look at that software. and look at how do we actually use that data to affect change in our organization, to start to optimize our deliveries a little bit better, so that we can earn higher margins on each customer. And then last but not least, this is a question we get a lot, is how do we start to engage customers with tank monitoring? This is a service that a lot of customers actually see very positively, because it's a kind of above and beyond service that can differentiate your offering as a fuel supplier when you use it correctly as you're engaging with your customers. So a lot on the agenda today. As we said, ask questions throughout, and we'll just get started here. So when we think about tank monitoring in general, one of the biggest things that tank monitoring does, and kind of where it all started, was that big decision on when to deliver. We're using K factors, we're using degree days, and while that works pretty well for really consistent usage, especially for somebody that is just on a heating account throughout the year, when we start to add other applications of using propane to that homeowner, when we start to work in pool heaters, generators, vacation homes, where we don't know when they're using their propane, it becomes a lot harder to start to manage it and to ultimately kind of figure out when we should be delivering and where that tank level is at. And so when we think about tank monitoring, really fundamentally what it solves is figuring out, all right, how do we reduce the amount of times we have to actually deliver to a customer? But how do we also manage that in a way that allows us to make sure that we don't run out that customer? Because that is probably the biggest reason why a customer might churn and might leave us for another fuel supplier. And so when we kind of do research for many organizations, what we see is that about 40% of all deliveries can be avoided through better efficiency around that. Now, there's a lot of other factors why you deliver to a customer, and so that number might be a little bit less depending on your organization. But in general, what we know is that there's a lot of deliveries made that we can save. Just by having more certainty in our data. What we see also is that tank monitoring, kind of where it was in terms of making better deliveries, and now where it's going, is that tank monitoring is really becoming a lot more about profitability. And so, that the first two are kind of how do we keep customers, right? How do we prevent runouts from happening in general? And so if we can have more certainty in our data, we can make sure that we're delivering timely. We can make sure we're also delivering timely when storms are coming, making sure that runouts are not happening as much as we want them to. And so right from the start, now we can retain more customers because less runouts are happening. The second part is now thinking about how do we actually earn higher margins on the customers we're serving today. How do we make sure that we're delivering more efficiently, making sure that we're not sending drivers out to ultimately top off a tank, with a 10 to 15% drop on that tank. And so earning more margins or higher margins per customers now allows us to do a number of different things, whether that's buy another bobtail. It could be offering lower prices to our customers, and so winning more customers there. And so that has a huge impact on other things we can do in our organization. And then last but not least, it's about, all right, how do we differentiate our business? How do we talk a little bit differently about our own offerings to our customers so that we can win new customers and potentially build additional lines of or streams of revenue with our existing customers, with services around tank monitoring and the like. And so what we've seen is we've seen organizations approach this a little bit differently in a number of different areas, and we'll talk a little bit about how that engagement happens. But all in all, being able to use tank monitoring as a messaging point with customers has been really, really positive for many of the customers that we talk to. And so as we get started, I'll pass it off to Collin to really kind of talk around, what you should be thinking about when you're looking at different providers around tank monitoring.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, just like Chris talked about, preventing runouts, higher drop sizes, and customer growth, we've had the essentials of tank monitoring solution. So it's always been about the hardware. The hardware has always existed. It's primarily been the only part of tank monitoring that people have worried about. The idea of remotely transmitting tank level once a day or once a week or however you like to receive that information. But in the last couple of years, we've introduced software. The software component is the portal. It's the real-time readings and hopefully a direct integration to the back office so that your CSRs, your dispatchers, anyone within the organization is living in one area, that back office, pulling tickets and seeing all that information at a high level. Now, the third piece that has started to come in, and we've started to introduce it into our application, is the mobile side. So everyone in the world today has a cell phone. People use online banking. They use it to communicate. Even my grandma uses FaceTime. The idea of a mobile app to connect to the consumers and have it branded and as a communication tool to request for delivery or special pricing is a new, unique tool to differentiate yourself amongst other suppliers. So the age-old question, you've decided to move forward with tank monitoring. Should you rent or should you buy? There's no right or wrong answer, to be honest with you. It's a business decision. There are a couple pros and cons for each side, though. In regards to the renting option, there's no capital expense. So what does that allow you to do? It allows you to deploy quicker and easier with avoiding that large chunk of cash putting down. On the buying side, there's obviously some tax implications, some tax benefits of purchasing outright. The other side of the renting option is that it protects you against future technology obsolescence. So in typical renting programs, if new technology exists and it's slowing your device down in the field, you should have the ability to have that replaced and be on the latest and greatest. Because at the end of the day, right now we're all operating off of 4G, which is the quickest network that exists. However, we don't really know when that 5G, 6G is going to be rolled out. Now, on the negative side of the renting is obviously the higher cost over the lifetime of the device. But what many people don't realize is that oftentimes that breaking even point of the purchase versus the rent happens in year 4 or 5. So at that point, if you're really trying to relate these to, say, a cell phone, where we're all probably getting a new cell phone every 3 or 4 years, it might make sense to enter into that rental option.
And so, Collin, when we look at kind of the rent versus buy, I know it's about probably 50-50 when we think about the people that we're talking to that are looking at tank monitoring. What are the things that you would see kind of within solutions that you would ultimately kind of tell people to look for and ask questions about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hardware is the basic function of any tank monitoring. There's some base requirements, and then there's also differentiating features. In regards to the network type, is it AT&T? Is it Verizon? Which network are you going to be plugged into and operating off of? Because no matter where you are in the country, different network types work better than others. The connection type is probably even more important than the network type, because if you're going down a certain avenue, whether it's cell or Wi-Fi, radio, satellite, there's different variables that go into it, which we're definitely going to touch upon. And the third component really is the ruggedness. is your tank monitor, or I should say, has your tank monitor been put through the ringer? We're out of Boston here, and we need to make sure that these devices can withstand the harsh New England winters. And then, in the summertime, hit over 95 degrees like it is today.
And so, I think for those base requirements, I mean, most tank monitoring solutions probably provide, a decent, option for all of those. When you kind of look at, what really differs among, solution providers, what are some of the things that, I know we have a few here, can you tell us a little bit about kind of what are the, different options there that you might kind of really want to consider?
Yeah, Chris, it's a good point. A lot of people tell you growing up, it's the little things that matter. And some of the things that you don't necessarily think about when going through the purchasing or renting decision, like we just talked about, the network, the connection, are they going to be able to stand the weather, is things like battery type. Are these field replaceable? Do you need an actual tool to pull it apart to then buy an expensive battery to replace, or pull it out of the field to then send it back to your provider for battery replacement? Or are they 4 AA batteries field replaceable? Are there mounting options? How are you actually connecting this to a tank? Are they magnets, or are they glue or tape or any other substance that could be knocked off during the winter or the wind? Lastly, is it manufactured in-house? Do they have overall decision-making power on the design, the functionality, and the quality control? Network impacts. So this is a hot topic. One of the first questions I always get is, what type of network are your devices built around? And as you can see, there's 4 main types. On the low end, cost-wise, we have radio. It's high management, and the coverage isn't that great. A lot of times they're low-level radio transmission. On the other end of the spectrum is the most expensive option, satellite. That has low management, pretty high coverage, but we have found in our research that the most optimal network to be on is cellular. It's in between the lowest and the highest on the cost size. The management is low, and the cellular coverage is the best between AT&T and Verizon. Wi-Fi is a good secondary option. We primarily suggest putting these on customers that can't connect in those weird areas of the country where they can connect to a Wi-Fi. On the negative side of the Wi-Fi is that you don't really have overall control of maintaining that connectivity. You're essentially relying on the homeowner to maintain that connection. And they don't always tell you when their Wi-Fi was knocked out, or the daughter changed the Wi-Fi password. So overall, the best bang for your buck really that we've found in terms of coverage, ease of use, and cost is the 4G LTE cellular.
Yeah, and I know this is something that you probably run into a lot too, but I think that's something to consider when you're getting the costs for the devices within proposals or things like that. Understanding what the network connection is, and then also understanding kind of the features with configurability with pings and things like that of how that is coverage is really important, because the price will differ, but the management over time, over the lifetime of that device, will definitely differ greatly there.
Yeah, it's the combination of that cost, the time management, and the percentage cover. What's the best fit for your business? We, as position ourselves as experts, have really found that the cellular connection has been the best.
Hey, Collin, I have a question for you guys, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is similar to a cell phone now, where you have the capability of buying a device that you can essentially set it up so it picks up Wi-Fi if it's available, but then it will switch off to cellular? If it's not, does that technology exist in the tank monitoring space today?
As far as I know, and speaking from our company, it doesn't. It's in the firmware that's built to deployed and connect either to the Wi-Fi or the cellular network.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
No problem. So next, we're going to look at the software side. Aside from the hardware, software is pretty important. On the base requirements, you want to see that tank level view. You want to have that reporting issues to see, hey, any of the devices that we have out in the field, are there issues with them that we don't necessarily know about if we're not driving out and checking on them on a weekly or daily basis? And the last part is that low tank alerting. Are you receiving alerts when a tank gets below a certain amount?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I think, Collin, when we kind of look at this, software is really important, right? As you were saying before, you know, tank monitoring really was a hardware play for a number of years, and now what you're seeing is that you know, all the providers need to have a certain level of ability in building software and mobile, just because of the engagement piece and the importance of it. And really, you know, I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, tank monitoring is a data play. The hardware is only as good as the data that it can provide and what you do with the data. And so when you kind of look at these lists, you know, yes, you're going to get a list of all of your tanks and what the current level is, right? That's very valuable. That's a base level area. You're also going to know when a device goes offline. You're also going to be able to alert when a tank gets to a certain percentage. But when we look at kind of all the other things that you can do, whether that's, you know, starting to build groups and do bulk alerting and make it really easy to set up those alerts across your team, bidirectional back office integration so that you can pull in data from your back office system so that you don't have setup issues or issues with the feed going back and forth, to having unlimited users and not have to worry about how many people on your team have access to the software. All that stuff I think is really, really important as you start to think about how are we going to use this data to affect change and to earn higher margins for our business. And then, you know, I think we'll talk a little bit about this, but this is the next, you know, slide here is also, you know, how is the provider helping us to understand and give us some idea in terms of things that we might be able to change in our business that will be beneficial. And so when we think about that, you know, it's really to that analytics. And so when we think about it, like delivery efficiency on an account basis is something that you probably should look for in your software. Being able to see that, you know, Anna and Joe Smith, we ultimately have an average delivery size of 20% to that account. There might be a reason for that. It might be next to an account that we fill all the time, and so we just top them off. But if they live in the middle of nowhere and we're still doing 20% all the time, that's an issue, right? And that's something we can fix, and that's something where we can earn more money. We don't need to do a truck roll, and we can figure that out. And so having analytics that looks into the account by account efficiency, looks at your efficiency month over month, see if you're improving, and is something that you can just look at to see, hey, is tank monitoring actually providing the efficiency gains that I want in my organization, is really important. And you know, one of the things too that I think we do that's kind of interesting is also looking at benchmarking. Are we doing well? You know, maybe it was a tough winter for everybody, and you know, efficiency went down across the board, and it wasn't just your business. Or you know, maybe you had the best efficient month or year that you've ever had, but hey, other businesses had just the same because of the current conditions. And so, you know, being able to actually see not only how you're doing, but also how you're doing against others, I think is really, really important. And so, Collin, what should we be looking at the mobile app? This is something that's probably the newest of that. And I know even some of our customers struggle in terms of how do they get that in front of people, and how do they use that to impact their business?
Yeah, as I said, mobile is a hot topic these days. Everybody wants something on their mobile phone. They want the ability to have their phone in their pocket or their purse and in real time pull up that low level tank reading. Now, what we've done is integrate into the mobile app a logo for suppliers. So each time a customer of yours opens up their smartphone, checks on their tank level from their vacation home or their second home, or even while they're out, picking up their daughter from school, they see your logo. They see that level. They can see the consumption chart to see, hey, we're actually using more, or we can notify our supplier that, their family's going to be in town next week and there's going to be 5 extra people in the house that we're going to be cooking and showering and everything else. So those are some of the base requirements. When you get into the differentiating features, Chris, what do you see that is starting to separate on the mobile side?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really interesting with the mobile side, especially if you have customers looking at it, is we see probably about, especially during the winter, we see about 60 to 70% of mobile app users logging into the portal at least once a week. So that in and of itself, you will get a customer that is seeing your logo once a week. When you kind of look at that. And so that's a really good touch point, right? And it's something of value where they can see the tank, they don't need to go outside. What we've also, kind of noted there is that it's also kind of an interface to do a number of other things, right? If you want to take the burden off of, people calling in to request a delivery, you can request a delivery from the app. It can be a tool to get referrals from your customers. And so there's a lot of playground once you get it into the hands of your customer to kind of ultimately manage that. We've also seen it be a very good tool for will call customers to have that conversation on when the delivery is going to be sent. The conversation, typically goes, and, early on it's, oh, hey, I'm at 30%, you need to come and fill me. And, then that conversation goes, no, I see your tank right now. It's at 35%. You're going to, that will last you, 2 to 3 weeks based on your current consumption. We'll actually send somebody out next week just so that we make sure that you stay full. Right, and so it has actually reduced the customer service burden for some customers that use it pretty well and get it in the hands of their customers. So we talked a lot about kind of that purchasing. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask them in the panel to the right, and we'll definitely get to those. But now let's talk about, all right, you made the purchase. You feel really good about it, and now it's like, oh, now we actually have to get the monitors on those tanks, and we need to figure out which tanks to put it on. And so there's a lot of decision making that happens around deployment, where I think this is probably the biggest point where tank monitoring might fail, because we weren't ready to understand where we should put these and how we should do it. And so when we think about kind of the process and some of the best practices, one of the first things that we make sure that every prospect that we talk to does is what we call a delivery history analysis. Now, Collin, I know you've done a ton of these for prospects, but can you kind of give us an overview of what this does, what this looks at, and ultimately how a company would use this to help with their deployment and their purchasing strategy?
Yeah, I've certainly done a lot of these DHAs analysis. Typically, sometimes crash my Excel, kind of like your computer's crashing today, Chris. But yeah, the DHA it's a valuable tool. So you've decided to either rent or purchase tank monitoring. You're fully in. These things arrive at your door, and what's next? The DHA can be a really special tool that allows you to see down to the customer who's deserving, who makes the most sense for a monitor to be on their house or commercial account. Now, nobody knows your business better than you guys do on the webinar here, but sometimes you don't necessarily understand how many deliveries you've actually made, the gallons you've delivered over the course of the last year. So what we do is we analyze, and many of the other providers out there should be able to do this for you, is take a look at a full year's worth of data on all of your accounts, break it down by the type of customer they are, oil or propane, and really get into how many deliveries you made across how many tanks and that drop size. And what we're able to do is calculate, hey, had you been dropping at a more sizable or favorable size, this is how many deliveries you could have avoided. Oh, okay, and so you've been able to avoid 15 deliveries last year? What does that really mean? Well, on a $50 to $60 delivery cost, the savings can add up pretty quick. So by being able to, down to the customer account, articulate, hey, if we're going to save 2 deliveries over the course of a year, then it's going to pay for itself. We're going to see that ROI in year 1. So the DHA is a really cool tool to really narrow in on, hey, let's deploy these at these 50 or 100 customers because we know we're going to see that ROI in year 1.
And I think, what's interesting and what, we'll do for, any prospects, first, this is free of charge. And so it's worth getting no matter if you decide to buy tank monitoring or not. It's just a good look at your overall business, how efficient you are with your business. The other question I think we get all the time, so I'll also address it, is, you don't need to give your customer names and all your customer information. Usually, it's just, account ID so that we can differentiate between, different tanks of the customers. And that's all the information that's needed, is just, the delivery analysis there. So it's pretty white labeled when most of the providers are there. But the other real value here is also deployment over time. If you get this delivery history analysis, it will recommend, here are the accounts where tank monitoring could be profitable, but many don't, buy all that amount right up front, right? Like you crawl, walk, run in tank monitoring. And so you'll buy that kind of initial pilot, and we'll start with those accounts that are most profitable. And then when you are looking to expand, usually it's dusting off that DHA and going after those next accounts. And one of the things I would also say is, like, this shouldn't be something that is just a one-time thing when you purchase tank monitoring. We also recommend, hey, on a yearly basis, it makes sense to do it, to see if, we're doing a better job with the tanks we're monitoring. See if there's other accounts and new customer accounts that come up that might be better or efficient. So really valuable tool, highly recommend it, even if, at the end of the day, you decide, tank monitoring is not right for us this year.
So you've run through the DHA. Let's talk about deployment strategies, because if you get these things shown up, delivered to your door, you really need to have a deployment strategy. And some of the best customers that we've worked with have really ironed this out, understand everybody's role internally in the company and what their job is to do. One of the first questions really is to decide who's going to be deploying these things. Are we going to have the drivers or the techs, or are we going to have a special, deployment team that's going to primarily focus on running through the DHA and deploying these in the most strategic places possible? Or lastly, is there's managed service plan that your tank monitoring company offers, where they actually send techs out on your behalf to deploy these things, so you don't have to worry about taking up time of your drivers or your techs. When to deploy is another.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Colin, when we kind of look at that, and so let's go, I think, one by one here, and we'll start going on stories that we know of organizations, doing this. So who will deploy? A lot of times that differs based on timing, based on either the initial deployment of a larger kind of tank monitoring set and ongoing deployment of that tank monitoring set, right? And so I think when you think about who will deploy, one thing is also look at how easy the solution is to deploy, right? Can a driver learn how to deploy it quickly and just deploy them when they're needed, throughout that process? And so we actually did a webinar with Sean Carroll with JP Carroll, and so he actually has used drivers, he's used techs, he's used a deploy team over the summer to manage that as well. But he will change based on what he needs, right? So during the summer, when the drivers don't have a lot to do, he might do a optimized route to deploy new monitors on accounts that he wants to do. He also, interesting enough, will actually keep monitors within their driver's trucks. And so if a driver sees an account that has like a higher drop size than they expected, he will allow them to put a monitor on that tank and tell him about it. And so he actually gives it, which probably can't do that for every fuel supplier or fuel business, but really interesting way to do that. I know Mark Wood from Chagrin, he hired some kids over the summer to ultimately do a larger deployment, for Chagrin Gas with that. So just thinking about who do you have on staff that can do it, how easy is it to teach them to do that stuff, and what makes the most sense. During the winter, you're probably not doing a huge deployment, but you're probably going to do small deployments upon deliveries, right?
Yep.
And so it might change.
Yeah, the ease of install really tackles the who, when, and how, right? So Chris, as you mentioned, that you're probably not changing a lot of things internally during your busy season, your winter season. However, deploying a tank monitor, as long as you can install it in under 5 minutes, you shouldn't have a problem making a delivery and installing a device at the same time. It also covers the how on the delivery. Just for deployment, you can certainly have it over the summer, like you said, Chris, hiring a couple kids locally to go out and install 10, 15 of these a day. It's a great way to get the community involved and get these things deployed on customers, but don't be afraid of also deploying one of these things upon delivery during the winter.
And I think, one other thing just to note, and again, it's advantageous for us for people to buy more and continue to deploy more and more tank monitors. But one thing to think about is, if you are looking at your tanks and expecting to deploy more, you should also start thinking about when you should think about that purchase, right? The lead times, depending on kind of a manufacturing process and sending it, depending on that can be weeks, right? So as you're thinking about it, make sure that within your deployment strategy, you're also thinking, oh, well, if I want to deploy more, I probably should purchase, a little bit ahead of time. And many also will keep stock in their office of 10 to 15, just in case they want to put it on new tanks or potentially swap them out.
Chris, let's talk about how not to install a device.
So there are a few things in general when you're doing the physical deployment that we've seen that are really kind of will affect the performance of the device, but aren't necessarily because of the device. So a few things. Make sure do not put your device under the tank hood. That'll just affect connectivity. and you probably won't get those readings as you kind of look through them. The other thing that you should also make sure is you might activate a device off-site and then bring it on-site to that tank. Make sure you reactivate it at the site that you have to make sure that connectivity happens. We see a lot of some people to go to like a very remote location and go, oh, it was activated and I don't know why it's not connecting. And it was mostly because they didn't check to see if the connectivity could actually send a signal from that location, which will happen on occasion. And then I think last but not least, make sure for water ingress and everything around that you have a drip loop. And so a drip loop is basically just a making sure that the wire is not taut and that you have the monitor kind of straight up and down so that water doesn't pool at the location of the actual joint. Really simple thing, just make sure that there's a little loop at the very bottom so that water can ultimately be managed there. So we talked about physical deployment, and now let's really kind of start to look at the things that are happening around deployment and why, when you're maintaining those devices, why devices will go offline.
So a big piece of tank monitoring, obviously you have to think about, is how to maintain the fleet. How do you decipher between devices failure and deployment issues? Is there an issues reporting tab inside of the portal to identify which devices have gone offline and why? How do you keep tabs on the offline devices? How do you work with the provider to troubleshoot? These are all things that you need to start thinking about and considering as part of that physical deployment plan. And then lastly, what's the process of swapping out the devices? Do you have devices in stock that allows you to quickly get a new device out if for whatever reason the device has gone offline?
Yeah, and I think when we think about that, we'll look at a number of different things around why devices might go offline. Can you pull up here? And we can look at all the different reasons why. One might be device failure. One can be device failure. So you can see water ingress. You'll also look at just connectivity failure in general. So there's definitely area there. You're dealing with hardware. Hardware can fail on occasion, so you should have a strategy around kind of managing that hardware and really kind of thinking about all the different things that might happen so that you can swap out those devices. But when we think about it, and so when we think about that, the other thing that we can see is that devices also go offline for issues that aren't about the device. First, maintenance, it might go off because a battery needs a replacement. It might happen because a gauge gets stuck in the tank. And so when we think about all those different areas, we see a number of different things that might go wrong there. And so that's where offline reporting is going to be really, really important. The other thing is, there might be an act of God. We have, when weather and everything else happens, especially squirrels. We've seen squirrels bite through wires and really go at some of these devices. So these devices have to undergo a lot of different things, and so there might be things that happen with that as well. And then last but not least is those deployment issues. Just make sure that you're not putting it under the dome of the tank, making sure that you have kind of that drip loop going on that device, and ultimately you're activating on site just so that you're starting it off in the right place. And so when we think about The next things is, just maintaining your fleet of monitors can be a job unto itself. And so make sure that your partner can help you go through those issues, making sure that you can decipher between, is this a deployment issue or is the device broken and needs to be fixed, swapped out, replaced. So, making sure that you work through all the different issues that are there. The other thing is making sure that your team knows how to troubleshoot those devices, right? So training of if your drivers are putting out these devices, making sure that they know, all right, well, it should take about this amount of time. If you're out there, try this many times. If this is the case in terms of activating and just best practices with deploying these devices. And so, that training should take 10 minutes tops to be able to do. But, just being able to start off on the right foot there can really help. And so, when we think about that, maintaining those will be just a talk around that partner and also, your process for how do you swap out those offline monitors when you're doing it. Last but not least, make sure that you have a backup plan for monitors that go offline, right? If you're relying on that data to make deliveries, make sure that you're either, in most cases, most of the tank monitoring solutions do this, but go back to degree days, K factors for managing those accounts so that you're not getting runouts within your business because a device goes offline.
Awesome. Now that we got that part of the way, let's talk about optimizing your tank monitoring. So some of the basic components of the softwares that exists out there today are not readily used. Some of the first things that you should do when setting these things up is set those alert configurations. Get as many subscriber users as you need into the portal to receive those alerts. So we have examples of customers getting their CSR reps in there, their dispatcher, even getting their drivers connected to the certain routes so that they're receiving the alerts, whether it's just a warning threshold or a critical threshold, so that if they're out on the road, they can receive a text message or a message from your back office saying that, hey, you're out in this area. We know this route is yours. Why don't you stop by, John and Sue to see if you can top them off and move on. The second part of this really is set up the software shortcut on the mobile device. So a lot of these suppliers, or I should say tank monitoring solutions that exist out there, have the ability for that mobile configuration. Make sure you're set up for mobile to utilize it while you're on the road. Last but not least, try to identify a couple team members as the team trainer. So we, for example, pushed out over 300 updates to our portal last year. These things need to be communicated amongst your organization so that you start to implement them, understand how to use them, and take advantage of them.
Yeah, and I'd say with that, Collin, I mean, the software should be easy to use. It should be pretty self-explanatory as you kind of are looking at different providers. But, I think it makes sense to have an expert on staff that, as people have questions about how to use the software and kind of manage the software, that you have a quick resource there. Now, your partner should also be available to answer any questions around the software. But if you have a kind of a software expert on staff that can take people through it, set up alerts and manage that, you're just going to be a lot more efficient, and you're probably going to answer many of the questions that your staff has.
Yeah. So, are you guys getting better? Are you starting to utilize some of these analytic tools that are available in a lot of these tank monitoring solutions to get better? Are you able to see savings by customer on an account level? Are you able to see that average drop size on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis to improve, to get better, to identify down to that customer account, hey guys, where can we get better? And last but not least, are you able to benchmark against your peers? It's a competitive industry, we all know, but are you able to compare yourselves and know, hey, where are we in line with the market today?
And what's really, I think, interesting here too is, we this is a new feature for us on the benchmarking side. But we started to send an email out to all of our customers with their benchmarking rank and looking at their average delivery size month to month and whether they're improving, not improving. And one of the larger fuel suppliers that we work with really loves it, and he actually sends it to the district managers. So he uses it as a way to incentivize and also kind of track from a very high level perspective how his different districts are doing within the organization from an efficiency standpoint.
So as we talked about earlier in the presentation, we've sort of moved from that just focus on hardware to the software side and the mobile side. And now the back office integrations is another hot topic. Are you starting to integrate your tank monitoring solution into the back office supplier of your choice? And there's different levels and different degrees of this. There's the two-way integration where you're mutually sending information. Information is populating each morning at a certain time so that you're able to see real time where each of your customers stand. Is there no integration at all? Are you still using the two systems outside of each other? And no backup for offline monitors, no ability to translate back into K factors or degree days. The ability to have this information in one spot is extremely valuable to your entire organization, from your CSRs up to upper management.
And what I'd say here is, again, we did a webinar last week with Mark Wendt from Shaker and Gas, and one thing he did say, and kind of looking back at his experience with tank monitoring, is he wished he thought about back office integration earlier at the start of the process, just because they had to kind of rework some of their processes later when they kind of realized the kind of integration and the different steps there. So I would definitely think if you use your back office heavily, it probably makes sense to include back office integration as a key point earlier on in your tank monitoring journey.
So Chris, let's tackle customer engagement. We've talked about how many people have cell phones today, how often people are on their cell phones. Let's talk about ways that we can start communicating with our end customers.
Cool. And so what we said, I think the mobile app is one of the best ways to engage, especially from a tank monitoring standpoint. There's just a level of transparency that makes the customer very engaged with your organization. And so what we've seen is that a customer is about 60% more likely to recommend their fuel supplier if they actually provide a mobile app with real-time updates. Now the question is, you can have a mobile app, but if you don't actually have the mobile app in the hands of your customers with your logo, does it really even exist? And so one thing I'll say is that most of the providers provide a mobile app. They all kind of differ in what the value that they provide. But if we're starting to deploy these devices on customer accounts, we should also start to promote that mobile app as part of that equation. And so, if we're thinking about that, compelling events where we can actually get somebody to download that app, it could be on a summer tank check. We actually see a number of people starting to put door hangers and things like that out when they do that. When you install that tank, being able to provide your driver with the information so that they can leave that behind at the customer account. And also new customers. One strategy we've seen is that organizations like Spicer will put a monitor on for the first year on any new customer account so they can get consumption data, but then they ultimately will pull it off once they have the consumption data and then offer it as a service to their customers. And so really interesting ways to do that. The other thing is starting to sell that. If you want to sell to your customers, we've seen organizations kind of go 50-50 here. As I said, some organizations use it just as a selling point to differentiate their service. So they offer it for free, but they also use it as a marketing tool with their existing customers that they're monitoring. But when we kind of also look at it, we're seeing organizations also start to add it as a service. So one good example example is for every generator customer. We're seeing some companies add this as a service because generators are incredibly hard to know how much propane is used, because you'd have to track kind of all the outages that happen within a given area. And so for those generator customers, in order to provide a high level of service, a monitor is included and a monitoring package is included, which can be anywhere from $100 to $120 a month, a year annually.
Awesome. I know we're running short on time here, guys, so want to open this up. Any questions come through on your end, Ted?
Yes. Give me one moment here. So you guys did, you talked briefly on it, I believe, but we did have a question in regards to just integrating the data collected with tank monitors to your back office software. And the question didn't specify which back office software they had, but just if you could elaborate on that in regards to your current integrations or integrations in general with tank monitoring.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's definitely a hot topic. It's something that we're approached with on a weekly basis for sure. It's something that our team is working on all the time for existing customers on the integration side. We do have integrations to just about every major back office software that exists out there. And we're always willing to explore new alternatives if there's something out there that is working with somebody that we don't currently integrate with.
Yeah, and I'd say with that, when we think about the one-way versus the two-way, the one-way is, hey, we'll pass the data into the back office, and then they'll use the tank monitoring data to kind of run their calculations on delivery and optimization. The two-way, where the two-way really kind of impacts is especially getting accounts up and running, and especially on the onboarding side. And so it's pulling that information from your back office and making sure that all the account information syncs seamlessly between those accounts versus having to input in two different places.
Excellent. There are a couple more questions. I'm going to connect you guys with them after the fact, but if we're going to wrap up with this one, kind of going back to the front end of the webinar, you're talking about the rent versus buy options. Is there any type of hybrid model out there that any of your current clients use, or that is available to someone that's considering both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is something that we have started to do with more and more suppliers. Essentially, what they want to do is avoid the upfront capital expense associated with purchasing versus rent. But there is a deal that we can structure where it's a lease to own, so you can take advantage of the tax write-offs and tax implications in order to cover both sides. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, very good. With that being said, we're coming right up on 10. We are going to wrap up this morning. Chris and Collin, thank you guys very much. If anyone would like to get in touch with Chris and Collin from Tank Utility, and you don't have their contact information, please feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you. I'm sure you can also find that information on their website. But with that being said, guys, thank you very much. Everything was very informative.
Thanks for putting this together, Ted. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
All right. Have a good morning. Take care.